Good evening. Good evening. Sticks and stones. We all know how the nursery rhyme ends, but how much do we actually believe it? So I'm Tom Carrico. I'm the director of the Center for the Study of American Democracy, one of half a dozen or more co-sponsors of our event tonight. I want to thank all the sponsors. Sarah Height will come up in just a moment and read them off and thank them formally. But I just want to say that the center is organized around the principle of civil and sober discourse about the important issues of the day. And academic freedom is one of those that we've heard a lot about nationally this year. And we're going to hear some interesting insights into that tonight. The quality of tolerance is not strained, we hope, but the degree to which we tolerate diversity, not racial, social, economic, but also political diversity, or scientific diversity. These are questions that we might have some room for doubt about ourselves. The idea of safe spaces. We should college, for instance, be a safe space, safe from ideas that challenge our own preconceived notions. And when we encounter those, what is the tolerant way in which to interact with them? So I'm now going to turn over to Sarah Height, Associate Professor of English, who's really tonight's really her brainchild, and I hope you all will have a good conversation. Sarah.
Well, thanks for coming out tonight. It's my great pleasure to introduce Alice Dreger to you tonight. We've got a lot of organizations and people to thank for her being able to be here, including the Kenyon Campus Community Development Fund, Tom Carrico and the Center for the Study of American Democracy, the Office of the Provost, the National Endowment for the Humanities Endowed Professor Sergei Lobановsky, the Thomas Chair of Creative Writing, Catherine Weber, the Program in Women's and Gender Studies, and the Kenyon Review. And I'd like to thank Andrea Leckleitner for her invaluable logistical work, and also the Kenyon College Bookstore for mounting a great display of Alice's work at the bookstore this month, and also being here tonight to sell. Now, I feel like I've gotten to know Alice Dreger for almost a year, even though this afternoon marked our first in-person meeting. Learning about her work and getting to have an ongoing conversation with her on, of all places, or in, of all places, Twitter, has been one of the unexpected intellectual happinesses of my past year. The Chronicle of Higher Education got my attention early last March, calling her a reluctant crusader and laying out her truly fascinating career trajectory. She got my attention again in late April when she live tweeted a session of her son's high school sex ed class and ignited an international discussion about sex ed curriculum. And she's kept my attention and earned my high regard with her consistently incisive, witty, and thought-provoking presence on Twitter and in the media, but even more so with the lucidity and elegance of her published books, which hit a particular sweet spot, and I think it's a tricky one, between where scholarly rigor, intellectual complexity, and compulsive readability overlap. The night I sat down to read Dreger's most recent book, Galileo's Middle Finger, Heretics, Activists, and the Search for Justice in Science, I planned to read one chapter, and then to keep reading a chapter a night until I finished. 5 hours later, I got up from my couch having devoured the whole book and just felt like I'd been rocked. The same thing happened when I sat down to read her 2004 book, One of Us, Conjoined Twins and the Future of Normal. Compelled by her way with narrative and by her commitment to historical precision and argumentative nuance, I got caught up, had my assumptions prodded and tested, and felt my worldview shifting under me. The same may happen to you here this evening. Having earned a PhD in the history and philosophy of science from Indiana University, where she wrote the dissertation that became her first book, Hermaphrodites and the Medical Invention of Sex, Alice Dreger soon found herself occupying both faculty positions and a role as a patient advocate for intersex people. Her scholarly and activist work have continued braiding together ever since. She is a historian of medicine and science, a sex researcher, a mainstream writer, and an inpatient activist, in her words. She publishes actively in realms both scholarly and mainstream, having written regularly for The Atlantic, The Pacific Standard, and Psychology Today's blog. She's also published op-eds in venues that include the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Slate, and The Guardian. Her TED Talk, Is Anatomy Destiny?, has been viewed nearly 1 million times. Her work on Galileo's middle finger, in which she argues for the necessity of the unfettered pursuit of evidence if we are to maintain a healthy democracy, was supported by a Guggenheim Fellowship. And the book received glowing reviews from the New York Times, Nature, Salon, and The New Yorker. The Chronicle of Higher Education is dead on when it calls her writing reliably funny and passionate and vulnerable. In August 2015, she left her part-time full professorship at Northwestern University's Feinberg School of Medicine in protest against her dean's censorship of published work that didn't fit the school's brand. Alice Dreger has enticed me again and again to reconsider my intellectual and political assumptions, to think about what I might be saying yes to without investigating thoroughly enough. The discomfort she's caused me has been nothing short of a great gift, and it's one I'm so happy to be able to share with you this evening. Please welcome me. Please join me in welcoming her to Kenyon Coffin.
One of the really fun things about Twitter is getting to meet people like Sarah, and one of the things I love about Sarah is that in spite of the fact that she's become a fan of my work, she continues to approach everything I say with skepticism, which has made me love her, because that's kind of the point of my work. She also knows, as I tweeted, and this is true, that there are 2 ways I gain followers besides tweeting sex ed, which gave me, I think, 15,000 followers in an overnight. The 2 ways are either I say nothing, and I get more followers, or I tweet tipsy. If all I was going for was Twitter followers, I would only follow those 2 rules. Thank you for having me today. It's been just such a joy to be here at Kenyon with so many of you, and it's just been great conversation all day, just with the students and the faculty and the alum. I just had a really great time, and I really appreciate being invited by Center for the Study of American Democracy, because while I was writing this book and when this book finished, when people ask me, what is this book about? It's a book about Galileo. I would say, no, it's a book about American democracy. And it is fundamentally a book about American democracy and the importance of research and the ability to research and teach in this environment that allows us to do what we need to do in order to support American democracy. So this talk is going to be fundamentally about that. I know the students I met with today in the writing class have read the preface to my book, and that talks very much about my parents' background as being sort of democratic nuts in terms of they both came from Polish families, and the fall of the Iron Curtain and the Soviet Union's descent on Poland was a big part of my childhood in terms of the psychological background of what we did. So my parents became very much American democratic activists in many ways. They were specifically right-to-life activists. They were conservative Polish Catholic, and they were right-to-life activists. So I was raised on picket lines outside abortion clinics. My dad ran for Congress. And so my parents were all about American democracy. In a lot of ways, this book is a weird sex researcher atheist tribute to them, which they find bizarre. But that's how American families work out. So today I'm going to run through a bunch of ideas, and I'm just going to give you an outline. I'm going to talk a little bit about my background so that you have a sense of kind of where I'm coming from. The students who were just with me heard about why I do this. It's so that you can understand my biases and understand where my critical blind spots are. And then secondly, the importance of academic freedom to social progress. And there I'm going to talk about a bunch of case studies that show, I think, the importance of academic freedom within universities to actually achieving movement forward in our American democracy. And it's never easy to achieve movement forward. There's a lot of question about which way is the way forward. But I think it's critically important that we have academic freedom as a backdrop, in part because the internet has caused the economic decimation of investigative journalism. And the consequence of that is that there are fewer and fewer protection systems available to average citizens in terms of finding out what is true in the world. And academia is one of the last places that has some degree of protection for the pursuit of the truth. Then we're going to talk about attacks on academic freedom. I'll draw some from my book, but unfortunately, since my book was published, there are more and more and more cases. So I'm going to draw on some cases that occurred after my book to give you a sense of the different forms that attacks on academic freedom take. And as you'll see, some of them come from the left, some of them come from the right, some of them come from outer space. There's a lot of different ways that academic freedom is attacked in America today. And then I want to conclude on a more positive note, asking what should we do now to try to protect American democracy and to protect protect specifically academic freedom as a basis for moving democracy forward. So, just to start off a little on my background, Sarah mentioned that my first book was based on my dissertation. It was called Hermaphrodites and the Medical Invention of Sex. And the reason it doesn't have a colon is because my partner actually challenged me to produce a humanities book that had no colon in the title. So it may be one of the only modern books published in humanities with no colon. He's a physician, so his running joke is that the reason so many humanities scholars have irritable bowel syndrome is overuse of the colon. As you'll know, you follow me on Twitter, he's very funny, although I make him funnier as I he tells me he can't live up to his career reputation in terms of his humor. But this book was based on my dissertation, which looked at what happened to the people who were labeled hermaphrodites in the late 19th century in France and Britain. And these are the people who had ended up in doctors' offices because they didn't have quite the standard male or the standard female anatomy. Sometimes that was very visible externally, but sometimes the doctor figured out that what was going on inside was different from what appeared to be happening outside. So, for example, I found cases of men who appeared to be menstruating through their penis, cases of women who seemed to have internal male organs, and then people who had external mixes of sex types. And when I came to this work, I actually didn't know that this even existed in humans, but my dissertation director recommended that I look at medicine and look specifically at the history of hermaphroditism because I was interested in gender and science, being a feminist science studies scholar. So I started writing about what had happened at that time. And what happened was, this was in the mid-1990s, people who had just started what became called the intersex rights movement contacted me and asked me to help them with their movement. It was a patients' rights movement, it still is today. So this is a picture from about 1996. The person in the bottom row in the middle is Bo Laurent, who went by the activist named Cheryl Chase. And she contacted me and said she had been reading my history work and she wanted to talk to me more, but she also wanted me to help with the current day medical system. And I said, I do dead people, I don't do living people. I'm a historian. But she said, well, look, you consider yourself a feminist, so at least look at what's going on today. And that was very easy for me to do because I was shacking up with a medical student I eventually married. And his books were on one side of the room and my books were on the other side of the room. So one day during a break from the 19th century, I went over to the late 20th century in his books. And I opened his book first to the section on clitoromegaly, which is when a girl is born with a clitoris that's larger than typical. Looks a little bit more like a penis. And what his book said, and I'm not making this up, this was a real medical textbook we paid a lot of money for. What it said was that if a girl grew up with a large clitoris, she might turn out to be a lesbian, so you had to cut off a chunk of her clitoris. And I was absolutely stunned reading this. This was 1994. And then I opened to the section on hypospadias, which is when a boy is born not with the urinary opening on the end of the penis, but on the underside of the penis. And what it said, I'm not making this up, is that if a boy could not write his name in the snow next to other little boys, he would turn out gay. So you had to use surgery to move his urinary opening from here to here, even though this is actually kind of a tricky surgery, because that way you would prevent him growing up gay. You know, Will and Grace was already on television, which was, for those of you who are very young, a show about openly gay people. We had the Women's Sexual Health Movement that occurred 20 years earlier. I mean, it was just astonishing to me that the textbooks would say this. And so I thought that I would go with these folks who were born with intersex conditions and go to the medical stash and say, look, you're using a system from the 1950s, it's broken, right? You're assuming that there's something wrong with growing up gay or lesbian. You're assuming that you have to have typical genital appearance in order to end up psychologically healthy, and there's no evidence for that. You're doing this, and the program also involved lying to patients about their history, because the idea was you fix it in infancy and don't tell them, because if you tell them, that will screw up the thing you were trying to prevent, which was gender confusion. So there were people actively lying to patients and advocating in the medical literature, lying to patients about their diagnoses and about their histories. And I thought we would go and say, look, this is so crazy. And they would say, oh, hey, right, we need to update this, of course. And instead, that's not all what they said to me. What they said to me was, honey, you just don't understand. When a child is born with atypical genitals, the mother cries, the father gets drunk, and we have to fix it, because otherwise the parents won't love the child. And so I set out with these folks to try to change the medical system to bring it up to date. And what I was going for with Bo was not an attempt to actually achieve an identity rights movement. We were not interested in having kids raised in a third gender. We thought they could be raised as boys and girls based on best guess scenario, basically based on what you think they're going to end up with, but leave open the possibility that it might be wrong. Leave the genitals intact so they could decide what to do with their own genitals. Be honest with them and provide psychosocial support. And if later when they grew up they wanted genital surgery, they could have genital surgery, but it would be their own decision whether or not to use tissue that functioned well. I thought that they would say that this was very reasonable, but they said, no, this is very unreasonable, that no child can survive this way. So one of our activist friends, Kira Tria, actually made a little tool I'm going to show you, which is an activist tool, but it really did represent what was going on at the time, and we called it the fellometer. Basically, the idea was that if you had a child born who was genetically female and had a clitoral stretch length of less than 0.9 centimeters, which is quite small, that was okay. But if her clitoris was any bigger than that, it required surgery. If a boy was born with a phallic length larger than 2.5 centimeters, that was okay. But if he had anything shorter, and I'm not making this up, the medical literature recommended he be turned into a girl. Because of the idea that having a small penis was so psychologically risky, it was better to take out his testes, build a vagina, and put that child on cross-sex hormones at puberty, and tell her that she had always been a girl, she was just an infertile girl. And they did this until about 10 years ago, until the intersex rights movement succeeded. If you can see that this was a joke tool we made, because here it says, just weeks by, few okay, Texan, and wow, surgery. The surgeons actually love these things, they thought they were hilarious. But this actually did represent what was going on at the time. And it's changed to some extent, but not as much as we would hope. So I joined the intersex rights movement, and I ended up doing a dual life. I was a professor at Michigan State University at the time, and I was also helping to run the intersex rights movement. And I ended up doing a lot of my scholarship as an activist around the intersex rights movement. So the next book I published is an anthology, Intersex in the Age of Ethics, which brought together first-person stories as well as stories from physicians. And then from there I branched out looking at what happens to other children born with atypical bodies. So I looked at conjoined twins, thinking in part that I could control for the reaction to sex, but I didn't realize a lot of the reaction to conjoined twins also has to do with sex. And I don't have time to get into that, but Sarah mentioned this book earlier as something that kind of does disorient you. The work on conjoined twins truly disoriented me, because as I discovered in that work, it turns out conjoined twins are generally very comfortable with the way they are, and that if you don't separate them as children, they don't regret not having been separated as children, which is quite a stunning thing to realize when you begin to approach the question of what it really means to have a different body. So, right about that time, I actually quit my job at Michigan State. The reason being I was running the intersex rights movement, I loved my writing career. I was also, I had a child that was born in 2000, there was just too much going on. And so I ended up taking on a sort of a new career, and just about that time I also, for reasons that are too complicated to get into, started to retire from the intersex rights movement proper and do my own scholarship. And so part of what I moved on to doing to do that was to take on a new project in 2005, 2006. And this was a project looking at a controversy that had happened around this book by a researcher named Michael Bailey. He's at Northwestern University. There's a book called The Man Who Would Be Queen, The Science and Psychology of Gender Bending and Transsexualism. And what Bailey had before was a very controversial idea about male to female transgenderism. He divided them into two types following the work of Ray Blanchard. And basically, he and Blanchard said that gender transition wasn't just about gender identity. It was also about sexuality and eroticism and about sexual orientation. And I don't have time to go deep into what he was talking about. But basically what he was putting forth was a very controversial idea that transition was partly about sexuality and satisfaction of sexual urges, not just about gender transition. And at this point in history, the transgender rights movement had desexualized transgenderism, in part because it was easier for the heterosexual population to accept it that way, and it was more socially palatable, it was more politically possible. And so the narrative of transgenderism had been desexualized, and Bailey was putting forth a narrative that was not anti-trans at all. It was very pro-trans rights. In fact, it assisted multiple people trying to help them get access to transition surgeries, transition hormones. But the reason he was putting this forward is because he felt it was scientifically true. Well, this happened in 2003. I came to it in 2006. And I was interested in this controversy because various interpolitics. I knew a bunch of the people who had gone after Bailey in 2003 when his book came out. When his book came out, he was accused of all sorts of things. He was accused of doing human subjects research without appropriate ROV approval, of making up data, of practicing clinical psychology without a license, of having sex with one of his transgender research subjects. I mean, really intense claims, any one of which could probably ruin your career, but certainly all of them together nearly ruined his career. And I was interested to try to figure out what happened. There were three particular transgender women who had gone after him: Andrea James, who lives in Hollywood, Deidre McCloskey, who is a distinguished economist and mathematician, and Lynn Conway, who is a computer scientist retired from the University of Michigan. And when I came to this story, I thought it was going to be a he said, she said story, where I thought what was going to happen was that Bailey had been sort of a clod, sort of insensitive, and these people got upset. And I ended up doing a year-long investigation of the whole thing. And what I actually found instead was that the people who had come after Bailey actually knew that the charges against him were not true. That they had, in fact, trumped up the charges and made up charges against him in order to basically stop his ideas. So basically what I was looking at was a situation where what he was putting forward was politically dangerous to these people, politically dangerous to their self-identity and their sense of the way they were going to engage the populace in terms of the politics. And so they tried to take him down using a whole host of ethics charges. And they nearly did ruin his life and nearly got him fired and nearly got him basically drummed out of the system. But they didn't. He managed to tenaciously survive. And when I came along and documented exactly what had happened, as you might expect, they came after me. The point at which I had to publish my work, I had two choices. One choice was not to publish, because I knew what they were going to do to him. I knew what they'd done to him. They'd gone after his children, they'd gone after his girlfriend, they'd gone after his job. They sent him, basically, through various channels, what appeared to be kind of violent threats. So I knew exactly what was going to happen to me if I published this. But I didn't feel I had a choice not to publish it because so many people had helped me. I ended up interviewing about 100 people, and I didn't feel like I could simply back away at that point. So I did publish it, and they did come after me quite intensely. They had, for example, filed ethics charges against me because I had talked about the question of whether or not it's ever okay to have sex with a research subject. They charged me with saying that sex with research subjects was okay, and therefore I must support the idea of sex with research subjects. When my husband dared to joke about it, they then filed a complaint against him for joking about the fact that I had had this ethics charge. What happened was the school newspaper Northwestern did an article about the ethics charge against me, which I wish they hadn't done. But when they did, my husband posted a comment on the article, and he said, I am the subject of both the sex and the research, and I must say both are excellent. But what happened was they filed a charge with his dean without explaining the background, simply saying that he had been joking about sex with research subjects. And so his dean, of course, was shocked and felt this was not appropriate to joke about, et cetera, et cetera. So they also did, at the time, what was easier, because Google's algorithms at the time were a little less sophisticated, they Google bombed me. And instead of, when you Google Alice Dreger, having come up with what had come up with a couple weeks before the publication, which was that I was this esteemed researcher, I was an LGBT rights activist, I was a very prominent intersex rights activist, what you would get was that I was an enemy of LGBT people, that I was a tool of the Catholic Church, which was hilarious to me, and that I actually wanted to send intersex people to the gas chambers. And if you went page through page, and that's all you found. My entire identity online was shifted within a couple of weeks. It was impossible to find things about me that were true. And so I had two choices at that point. One was to simply crawl into a hole and die and change everything I was working on, and the other one was to go forward. And enough people contacted me about their own stories that I decided to try to go forward. And so I proposed to the Guggenheim Foundation that I do a book on clashes between identity politics activists and researchers who said unpopular things. Because I wanted to study how to protect both of those groups. Just because of what had happened to me, I didn't feel that I should turn on activist work. I still cared very deeply about the rights of LGBT people, about intersex people, about all sorts of social and political rights. But I also felt like this was out of control. And I wanted to know what we could do to try to protect both research and social justice advocacy. And so I took up that work, and it was supposed to last a couple of years. It ended up lasting 6 years. And the book Galileo's Middle Finger is actually the result of that work. That I sort of traveled the country interviewing both activists and researchers sort of the setup on, and this is the work that resulted from that. So I'm going to draw a little bit more about that as we go forward. And I'll tell you why I had to resign my work, but it had to do with this, I'll tell you about later, about this internal journal that we published in my program at Northwestern. So what happened was, after I quit my job, I gave up tenure at Michigan State and went independent, but Northwestern offered me a small part-time full professor, well, that time associate professorship, and then I was promoted to full professor. And I thought, sure, why not? You know, it was a little bit of money. I just had to go teach every now and then in Chicago, which was not too far from home, about 200 miles. So I would go, I would stay at a hotel, teach, and come back home, and it was not that big a deal. But I was asked a couple of years ago for 2014 to edit a special issue of our magazine journal, which is a medical humanities journal. And I was given the theme of bad girls. Every issue is on a theme, and we all thought it would be funny if I did the issue of bad girls. And unfortunately, the issue of bad girls is ultimately led to my dean censoring me, ironically, and it led to my resignation. So I'll tell you more about that later. So I now work independently without a university affiliation, at least for this year. Various people ask me, do you want to have a university affiliation? Sorry, this is I told them I thought it was important that I would be next to people for a little while. I spent the whole year traveling, talking academics, which has been fun. So let's talk about the importance of academic freedom to social progress. This is a great example. The intersex rights movement is a great example of the importance of academic freedom to social progress. The reason being that while the intersex rights movement probably would have had a lot of success even without the academics who were helping it, a huge amount of power that occurred within the intersex rights movement happened because academics assisted. So there were people like me assisting on the history and the ethics front, people like Suzanne Kessler helping with regard to sociology, all sorts of people, Anne Professor Sterling, lots and lots of academics, mostly feminist academics, who were protected within our university systems and allowed the space and the time and protection to say things that were very unpopular to say within the medical realm, and to fight really hard within the medical realm. So this is a great example. But so much of what we see in terms of liberal democracy movements can be traced back to academic freedom. The reason being the feminist movement, the disability rights movement, the gay and lesbian rights movement, so many of these movements were made possible because of the kinds of academic freedom around education that occurred with young people who then were educated enough to understand why social systems needed to change to end up with better democratic systems. And so this is just one of many examples of the ways in which academic freedom has led to rights movements being supported not only through good research, but also through good teaching that has led people to think carefully and critically about the kinds of democratic systems we have. Just one other example from my own work, and it's traced out in the book. I'm not going to go big into detail here, but as I was thinking I was wrapping up this book, some of my old intersex rights activist colleagues contacted me, including some of the clinicians who were activists, guided me regarding one thing that was happening in the intersex treatment world, and that's that mothers at risk of having a particular condition in their daughters, where the daughters would be born with in-between genitalia, they were being offered a prenatal drug, dexamethasone, in order to prevent intersex development in the daughters. Theoretically, I don't have a problem with that, because theoretically, I don't think there's anything more special about being born intersex than being born male or being born female. So if theoretically it's prevented, and not where being a surgeon doesn't come after your daughter's clitoris, theoretically that sounds like a reasonable thing to me. But in practice, what we found, what these people contacted me to let me know, was that the chief proponent of this work was in fact telling parents that this had been found safe and effective for mother and child, and then turning around and taking money from the NIH, the National Institutes of Health, to find out if it was safe or effective. And she was using the same parents who had been drawn into her clinic under the claim that she put to them that it was safe and effective, to then study them later, to try to figure out, using her grant money, whether it was safe and effective. And I'm not going to tell you the whole story of that, but I'll just tell you that the way this played out was absolutely morally disgusting. And they traced it out in the book. The work that I did on this ended up taking me another several years. And there's no way I could have done this work without the assistance of Northwestern University. The reason I was able to do that work so well, I could do it independently, but it was made much more possible by the fact that I had a whole group of librarians assisting me. I had medical students working with me on projects that assisted me. And I had basically my dean's office protecting me. And so when my dean's office would get calls complaining about the fact that I was going after Cornell's medical school and Mount Sinai's medical school, where the most awful stuff around was happened, and I was fighting the FDA tooth and nail in part of this, what happened was my dean said, we don't really care, she has the right to study what she wants to study. If you're showing us that she's doing something unethical or she's promoting false information, we will certainly get involved because that's an issue of fraud and that's an issue of academic responsibility. But if what she's doing is showing her work and showing the fact that she's finding what she says she's finding, that's academic freedom. And so for a long time I was protected in Northwestern. But I'm hardly alone. So if we look at, for example, the way that genetics has developed in terms of trying to understand who's guilty or innocent of a crime, that work has been developed in universities. And innocence projects at universities all over the country work actively, specifically on specific justice cases to try to get people who appear to be innocent out of jail. So all over the country we find innocence projects in law schools and also in journalism schools working specifically to try to figure out how to improve the criminal justice system to make it safer for people, because right now the criminal justice system is not very safe for a lot of people, but especially people in very marginalized groups. Just another example, Naomi Oreskinson and Eric Conway's book, Merchants of Doubt, which you may have heard of, which is a really important book, years ago, it showed step by step how it was that the climate change deniers were in fact just playing games rhetorically and politically and scientifically, and that in fact what they were doing was creating doubt where there didn't need to be any doubt, where in fact climate change is clearly occurring. This again is where protected dignity and freedom and done incredibly important work in terms of trying to figure out how to start to address climate change. Another example, and I talk about this one in the book, The Natural History of Rape, which was a very unpopular book among feminists like myself, a book by two biologists, Randy Thornhill and Craig Palmer, who wanted to look at the question of to what degree we might be able to understand rape and sexual coercion as something that arises out of evolutionary biology. And so this was misrepresented in the press as being an apology for rape, as excusing rape. It did nothing of the kind. What in fact happened instead was that Palmer and Thornhill recognized that the feminist claim, rape is primarily about power, not about sex, had gone so far that prosecutors were actually having trouble prosecuting rape cases because unless they could prove there was some sort of power relationship going on, they couldn't get a conviction. If they made the argument simply the guy did it because he wanted sexual gratification, that was inadequate because the defense attorneys were using the feminist word saying, oh no, rape isn't really about sex, rape is about power. So unless you can prove this alleged rape case is about power, you're not going to get a conviction. So Palmer and Thornhill actually wanted to assist with rape prosecution and also rape prevention by looking seriously at the biological basis for sexual coercion and rape in humans and other animals. But they were very much attacked for all of this. In fact, many people called for their firing. They were subject to death threats. But it was their teams who actually protected them in that case. In fact, Craig Palmer was a very vulnerable assistant professor at the time he published this work. And yet his team protected him and made sure that he was safe and was able to continue to work in spite of the fact that he was very widely misrepresented in the press. And then most recently, a case that hits home for me, the Flint water crisis. And the reason it hits home for me is because the medical student I married grew up and became a doctor, who then grew up and became the dean of Michigan State's medical school, which he now is. And so he's actually in charge of Michigan State's response to the Flint water crisis. And he set up the public health program in Flint that is pre-existing, that helped create the faculty that called out what happened. So as you may know, in Flint, there's the Republican people in power in the state of Michigan used the emergency management system to basically take over Flint financially. And part of what they decided to do was not to spend money trying to avoid having problematic water. And so they cut back economically on water protections. And what that resulted in was a situation where you have highly corrosive water running through the pipes in Flint. The pipes in Flint are old and contain lead. And if you don't use anti-corrosives, which actually don't cost very much money, if you don't use anti-corrosives in the water, the lead flakes off and leaches into the water. And so Flint has ended up, lead in the water, by the way, doesn't look cloudy. It looks cloudy because there's all sorts of other problems with the water. Lead is invisible in the water. But what's going on is that thousands and thousands of people have been lead poisoned in Flint. And what happened at first was that the governmental system, including the Department of Health, including the EQ, denied that there was any problems with water in Flint. But the people who were fighting them were academics who were fighting them. And they were being protected by their universities in terms of academic freedom. So on the top, you see Mona Hanna-Matisha, who's a pediatrician and public health researcher at Flint, Michigan State. Rick Sadler was a geographer, a PhD in geography at Michigan State, who mapped out where the water cases were occurring. And then Mark Edwards at Virginia Tech, with his team at Virginia Tech, who also came in and fought really hard to prove what the government kept denying, which was that there was in fact lead in the water and there was a major public health crisis occurring. So these are all instances in which if you didn't have a situation where you had public health people protected, geographers protected, and in the case of Mark Edwards, engineering professors protected, you would have a situation where you have uncontrolled situations with nobody functioning as a check in the system to create a safer system. Okay, so what about the attacks on academic freedom? We've got through my background and the importance of academic freedom to social progress. I'm just going to group these into categories so that you have a sense of kind of how these attacks form. A really obvious one we've already talked a little bit about is identity politics based. This turns out to be quite common in terms of the types of attacks on academic freedom. And it often occurs that these happen from the left, not necessarily from the right. And that's interesting because a lot of, if you look politically at the spectrum of people who are professors, they tend to skew very hard left. And so you might expect that the left wouldn't go after academics, but the left does go after academics if they're saying something that's threatening to an identity politics-based group. And that occurred, for example, with the Bailey case, but we could also look, for example, at the case of Chuck because farmers don't want big sheep because they don't reproduce. Right? It's a farming issue. It's not really a political issue for farmers. It's an issue of you feed this animal and it never ends up reproducing. And so Roselli was interested in that for that reason, but he was also interested for a purely scientific question of where does sexual orientation come from? And when he started doing his work, this was before we had the whole movement Born This Way. And so the idea that you might say that people were born this way was relatively unpopular. What happened was PETA, the People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, which is an extreme animal rights group, decided to get the LGBT world all riled up against Chuck Roselli because they claimed what he was really doing was creating a eugenic system that was going to be used to avoid having gay children in the human population. This was not true, but they put out this claim about him, and the LGBT world went crazy on Roselli. And Roselli's university administration, his university president, ended up getting 20,000 emails calling for his firing. Martina Navratilova ended up coming personally after Chuck Roselli because she's both a gay rights activist and an animal rights activist. He got completely crazy. And so this really threw Roselli for a loop. And I won't tell you the story completely what happened to Roselli, but I'll just say that what happened was his university administration really did beautiful work in this case. But we can look at more recent cases too, like the case of Erica Christakis, who at Yale University, the Yale University administration put out a note saying, at Halloween time, saying it would be nice if people could be culturally sensitive and not, do things that are culturally insensitive in terms of costuming and partying and all that sort of stuff. And she was a lecturer at Yale and also worked as a master in the residential system at Yale. And she responded by saying, maybe we could go all just agree that this stuff doesn't have to freak us out completely, that in fact people can make some dumb mistakes, make some choices, we can talk about it. And as a result of that, she was seen as being an apologist for people who wanted to do blackface. And she was so attacked at Yale for this by lots and lots of people, especially students, that she ended up actually resigning her position as lecturer recently because she simply couldn't take the attacks anymore. She was recently featured in the New York Times. Another case which it doesn't fall simply on left or right is the case of Stephen Salita at the University of Illinois, Chicago. Salita was offered a position by the University of Illinois, Chicago as a very distinguished researcher. And then all of a sudden, some tweets he had put out that were offensive to some people with regard to the Israeli approach to the Palestinians. He put out some anti-Israeli posts on his Twitter feed, was used to all sent to his university administration by lots and lots of people. And in spite of the fact that he had already been offered an associate professorship with tenure, the university administration withdrew the offer because of the fact that he was seen as being politically objectionable. In fact, he's ended up taking a position at the University of Beirut, and he's now suing UIC and probably will win, because in fact he had already been offered a position and it was denied to him simply because of his political viewpoints. That's not to say that we should agree with his political point of view, but it is pretty shocking that what happens is that a professor on his Twitter account or her Twitter account has to worry that what they're going to say is going to be politically unpopular enough that they can have their tenure essentially withdrawn. He had already, by the way, resigned his position at Virginia Tech, so he was already without a position in his position at UIC was withdrawn from him. Another case more recently, this one does feel like it comes from the right. Mauricio Hawkins at Wheaton College. Wheaton College is a private Christian university, so of course it can set its own rules, but it's supposed to have rules about academic freedom nevertheless. And in her case, she dared to make some comments that were supportive of the Muslim population after the Charlie Hebdo attacks. In fact, decided on her own to wear a hijab, even though she's a Christian woman, in solidarity, saying we worship the same God, quoting the Pope saying we worship the same God, we talk about the same issues that we talk about morality. And yet she was driven essentially out of her position at Wheaton College because of the opinion that she's not Christian enough to teach at that school. Again, private Christian school, but academic freedom is supposed to extend to people regardless of these kinds of differentiations within universities. And it seems to me quite dangerous. What we find over and over again is disproportionately women and people of color who end up being driven out of university systems when these attacks occur. The attacks do happen to white men, but when we see people driven out, it's people like her and people like me. So another form of attack that occurs is internal ideological wars within universities, which are attached to identity politics groups. But I'll just give you one quick example that I used in my book, and that's this case of what happened with the book Darkness in El Dorado, where there were researchers who had been studying the Yanomama people, and particularly Napoleon Chagnon, who's seen on the right. This is a picture of the 1960s of what they were doing in major work, and James Neal, a very famous physician geneticist on the left. The claims made against them within the American Anthropological Association was that they had purposely carried forth a system of genocide, trying to purposely infect the Yanomama people with a bad measles vaccine in the 1960s, eugenics type experiment. I ended up doing a year-long research among, in my book, Galileo No Finger. This ended up occupying a whole year of my time. And the reason was, not that it had not already been documented that the charges against Neil and Chagnon were false. The whole story turned out to be false. But what happened was the American Anthropological Association decided to essentially put them on trial for 2 years. And I found in my research that the heads of the American Anthropological Association knew full well that these guys had not done anything wrong, but that they had decided to go ahead and put them on the show trial because they wanted to prove that they cared about indigenous peoples around the world. So Neil, who was dead by then, and Chagnon, who was still alive, were essentially used by scapegoats by the hyper-liberal American Anthropological Association as a way of proving that we care about indigenous people, so anybody who said to be harmful to indigenous peoples has to be strung up in effigy and hung. And that's what happened to Chagnon. So the internal political wars that sometimes occur in academia can get extremely ugly. Then there's conservative political attacks, much more overtly. So I talk in the book about the case, for example, about this famous meta-analysis that was done about pedophilia. It was a study using college students, or using a whole bunch of studies of college students, looking to see what types of harm occurred when people were subject to childhood sexual abuse. And this article actually parsed out which kinds of harms occurred. And that meant it found that not everybody was irreparably harmed when they were subject to childhood sexual abuse. You were more likely to be harmed if you were female than if you were male, more likely to be harmed if it was incestuous abuse than if it was from a stranger, more likely to be harmed if it was also physical and emotional abuse that occurred at the same time. And so they were parsing out what occurred. But the bottom line message of this was that not everybody is irreparably harmed. And so what occurred was the pedophile activist groups, and these do exist, including the North American Man-Boy Love Association, NAMBLA, I'm not making that up. NAMBLA actually held this article up and said, see, kids are harmed by pedophilia, so you should let us have sex with kids. Which is not at all what this article said. But what ended up happening was the American Congress decided to go after this paper because they were still mad that Bill Clinton was impeached but not out of office. And so they decided to go after this paper and assault the American Psychological Association having published this paper. And this is the only paper in the history of the United States ever condemned by an act of Congress. It actually got a unanimous vote with a couple of people who abstained. How are you going to vote for this paper, right? Once this paper is called Apology for Pedophilia. But what ended up happening was that these researchers were widely assaulted for supposedly being apologists for pedophilia, even though that's not what they said. But what the worst thing that happened in the situation was the American Psychological Association decided to capitulate and apologize for the paper, which they never should have done. And a bunch of other scientific societies said, we do not apologize for papers that go through peer review. We can criticize them, we can retract them if they're in error, but we don't apologize for the process of science. Another example of a political conservative attack is the case of Gene Nichols at the University of North Carolina. Nichols is a very distinguished law professor who had his center there for the study of poverty. And what he was specifically doing was looking at social policy that caused poverty and caused exacerbation of the problems that come with poverty. The Republican establishment within North Carolina decided to go after him specifically because a lot of the stuff he was publishing was critical of them. And so they basically had the Board of Trustees do a review of programs and policies, and his center was shut down. It was one of the most esteemed centers in the country for the study of policy, and was shut down for overtly political reasons. So basically, this could happen to almost anybody at a state university. Then you have Title IX guise attacks, which are relatively new, but are definitely concerning. In the case of Laura Kipnis, also at Northwestern, where Kipnis dared in the Chronicle of Higher Education to make fun of Northwestern sexual harassment policy. Northwestern sexual harassment policy was ridiculous. It basically said that if you were in any teaching or coaching capacity whatsoever, you were not allowed to have any romantic relationship with anybody in an undergraduate capacity whatsoever. So in other words, if you were an assistant basketball coach, right, who was 25 years old, and you ran into an undergraduate woman or man at the bars who happened to also be a 25-year-old with an undergraduate geology major, you could not date that person because you somehow had power over that person, because you happened to assist and coach a basketball team. So she made fun of this and talked all about the problems of infantilizing college students with regard to sexuality, infantilizing the faculty. And as a consequence, a couple of students complained, and the university decided to launch a major Title IX investigation against her, saying that she had potentially caused sexual harassment by simply joking about the sexual harassment policy in a Chronicle of Higher Education. The investigation into her went on for months. They hired outside lawyers. They told her she wasn't allowed to have a lawyer, which of course isn't true. And it went on and on. It ended up actually sweeping the university president because eventually somebody else made a claim against the university president. They made a claim against the Senate president, the faculty senate president. It just went on and on and on. It became completely ridiculous. But this is one of the things that's occurring now is Title IX is being used as a way to shut people down from discussing sexuality in classes. People are being increasingly afraid to teach about sexuality in classes because of Title IX charges. So this is becoming deeply problematic, especially for those of us who teach and research about sex, as a lot of us try to do with people becoming afraid. And then finally, in my own case, the branding concern. You know, you cannot make this stuff up. So I finished this book, right? I finished this book manuscript, which is all about academic freedom. And what happens? Literally, as I'm fact-checking and proofing and lawyering the book, my own dean censors my work. So, and I told him, this is the wrong person to do this to, right? Like, I just finished a book that will be a big national book, calling on people to stand up for their academic freedom. And you're putting me in the position of now having to either bow to censorship or fight you, which I don't really want to do because Northwestern had made my book possible. But what happened was that I had solicited for the bad girls issue essays by people, as we always did, essays and articles talking about issues of the bad girl within medicine. So we do medical humanities and bioethics in that program. And one of the articles I got was from a cultural anthropologist at Syracuse University, Bill Pease. And Bill Pease was spinal cord injured at the age of 18. He told the story about what had happened to him in a rehabilitation hospital in 1978, so a long time ago, in 1978. And the story that he told was that he was trying to ask the doctors about his sexual life. Would he be able to have sex? Would he be able to have children? And nobody would answer his questions. This was a time when men and women with spinal cord injuries were for the first time living long lives. And so he was really worried about this. And he tells the story of how he was in a rehabilitation hospital for a long time. And one of the nurses that he got to know there well ended up giving him oral sex in order to show him, you're going to be okay, it's going to be fine. He had a good relationship with her, it was a consensual sexual act, it was done as an act of compassion. He does not promote this as something that should happen in rehabilitation hospitals, but he does use it to raise the question, where are we today? Are we yet dealing with the sexual anxieties of people with disabilities? Are we yet addressing the sexual needs of people with disabilities? And he refers to the period as the Wild West. He doesn't promote that this should happen today. He's telling a story about 1978. Believe me, it's not pornographic, honestly. He talks about how just before this occurred, he thought he had bladder control, finally under control. He had wet himself in the middle of the night. He was so upset that he wet himself that he was crying. When he pushes the nurse call button, she comes to him to help him change the sheets and changes his clothing. So it's not a Playboy scene by any means. But this article was published along with all these other articles about abortion, about women as caregivers, all these heavy-duty articles that had been written. They were beautiful articles. And my dean one night opened it up and was shocked to read this article and decided that this article might ruin the Northwestern medicine brand. What had happened was a couple of years before, the dean had arranged for our medical school faculty practice to basically be sold to the hospital corporation. And when that occurred, we all got subsumed into a hospital corporation brand. And what he was worried about was that somebody might find this article and decide that this was somehow part of the Northwestern brand, and so it violated the branding agreement we had with the hospital. And he forced the people who, in my department, put this stuff online to take it off offline. They couldn't pull back the paper copies, because the paper copies, 3,000 of them, were already sent out to our subscribers. We had 3,000 subscribers, so that was already out. But he pulled the physical copy off, the online copy off. I tried fighting him for 15 months. I kept saying to him over and over again, you do not have the right to censor work that has been written by academics, peer-reviewed by academics, published by academics, and they kept saying to me, we paid for it, so therefore we have the right. To which I kept responding, you pay for everything I do, technically. You pay for at least a little part of it. Am I supposed to run all of my work past you? Time and again, I tried to get them to withdraw the censorship and stop. It was only 15 months into the censorship when I told them that Bill Pease and I had it, and we were going public with the censorship. This was after my book was published. Said that I just had it, we went public with the censorship. They said, okay, you can put it back up. So we put it back up on, and I decided, forget it. Let's talk about it anyway, because this cannot happen. The irony was Bill Pease's article was about the silencing of the sexuality of people with disabilities. And that's exactly what my dean was doing, was silencing the sexuality of people with disabilities. So it was intolerable to us. So we ended up talking about it publicly. resign my position. I will say the graphic that we chose to use with the article maybe is what set my team up, although we all thought it was a great graphic. I'll show it to you in a second. It's from a website on sexuality and disability rights. It was a site for adults with disabilities talking about the right to have sexuality, and that was the graphic. And I think it's perfectly appropriate to have as a sort of object of art to talk about it in that domain. So what should we do now, given that there are all these problems occurring? Just to bring it home. I have a couple of recommendations. My first recommendation would be teach, learn, research, and converse boldly while you still can. Because the systems are shutting down around us. All over the place, we are getting the message. We cannot teach, we cannot learn, we cannot research, and we cannot converse boldly within academic systems. And I think that is terrible. Because the people we have in our care in terms of the students and the research that we do is incredibly important to talking about what goes on in America or what goes on anywhere else in the world. It's an incredibly important part of the social democratic movement. So keep being bold while you still can. Secondly, spread and use protection. It's way past time for those of us who are in tenured, comfortable positions to start worrying about the overuse of adjuncts as a way to start cutting into the ability for those of us with tenure to have any kind of control over university systems. It is really dangerous to have this two-class system that we've allowed to get out of control. And I don't know what the state of it is in Kenyon, but nationwide, over half of faculty today are in adjunct part-time positions. It's a dangerous situation we have on our hands. I also recommend using when necessary the FIRE, which is the Foundation for Individual Rights and Education. They basically fight academic freedom fights. They're often seen as being very conservative. I actually see them as being more like very dedicated to academic freedom. They've assisted me, for example, with my own fight in my own university. Maintain control of academic governance. Again, I don't know where you're at in Kenyon, but in many universities, this is slipped by the way. The reason is academic governance is not rewarded within the system. It used to be rewarded as an important service project, but it's less and less rewarded in the academic system. Why? Because the administration doesn't really want you to work on academic governance, because if you do, you're typically fighting the administration, right? So there's no reward system built into it. And what we end up having is people who are on the verge of retirement, who are past the age of age to retire, fighting old battles instead of really fighting vigorously at the point which we should, which is often mid-range academics should be fighting hard right now. Even junior academics should be actively involved in academic governance. That way you can't have a system like you have at Wisconsin, where you can fight back like they're doing at Wisconsin, where basically what's happening in Wisconsin is the governor, Scott Walker, is essentially getting rid of tenure in the University of Wisconsin system. Technically it still exists, but basically the decision is that if the trustees, and the trustees are beholden to the government system, if the trustees decide that a program is no longer relevant or no longer important to put resources into, it can be gotten rid of and the tenure faculty let go. And that's exactly what happened in UNC. So if we let go of academic governance, if we end up in a situation where the trustees or people even higher up in the trustees are allowed to decide what we can do in our classrooms and what we can do in terms of our research, we are in an extremely dangerous position. Work on academic responsibility as we work on academic freedom. And what I mean by that is, if we're going to have freedom, then we have to live up to that freedom by being academically responsible. And one of the ways that I think we do that is to be really careful about our own work. I am perpetually shocked by how sloppy some people are in their work if they publish it forward, because there's the whole publish more rather than publish high quality. We really have to hold each other to a high standard of academic responsibility. And sometimes that means calling each other out when somebody says something that's obnoxious, discriminatory, biased. Absolutely. But it doesn't mean we drive them out of the university. It means we engage them and ask them to think about whether or not what they're saying is creating a hostile environment to somebody who is entitled to be here. And can we elicit from them, for example, an apology, a discussion of how we're going to handle it in the future? Not to drive people out, but to engage them responsibly in those conversations. I strongly recommend that every university adopt what is now being called the Chicago Principles. This was put out by a group led by Jeffrey Stone, who's the former provost of the University of Chicago about 2 years ago. You can find it easily online. It's a beautiful statement about what universities are supposed to be about, and this is what it says at the core. In a word, the university's fundamental commitment is to the principle that debate or deliberation may not be suppressed because the ideas put forth are thought by some or even most members of the university community to be offensive, unwise, immoral, or wrongheaded. And let me tell you, Jeff Stone is a heavy-duty liberal. He's somebody who's been fighting for gay marriage for like 25 years. It is for the individual members of the university community, not for not by seeking to suppress speech, but by openly and vigorously contesting the ideas that they oppose. Indeed, fostering the ability of members of the university community to engage in such debate and deliberation in an effective and responsible manner is an essential part of the university educational mission. So you do not have a situation where you tell people they're not allowed to say things. You have a situation where vigorous debate is promoted. So related to that, be prepared to defend the rights of people who are irritated. I spend a lot of time nowadays defending the rights of people who are irritated. I often defend people and smack them upside the head and say, would you please stop saying that? And here's why you should stop saying it. It's not true, it's not helpful, you can trace it in a way that's more helpful, but I'm still going to defend the rights. And that's part of what you're going to find yourself doing sometimes on your campus, is having to defend the rights of people who are irritated. How do you do that? You say openly, just like I do. This person bugs me. I wish you would stop saying this crap because here's why I think it's wrong, but here's why I think it is the right to say it. When I first came to Northwestern, we had a Holocaust denial. We needed it. But the university provost kept protecting him over and over again. Why? Because he kept saying to us, that's what it means for me to protect you, is to protect him. And I loved that. I loved that I was at a university to protect the Holocaust denial, because I felt safe. Call on your administration to defend your rights collectively and individually. So when the flood water crisis was happening, or started happening most vividly, and Mona Hanna-Attisha, the pediatrician who was the big whistleblower against the government at Michigan State, ended up in a situation where the government was saying she was wrong, she was irresponsible, she was wrong, she was a bad scientist, and she kept saying, I'm right, I'm right, right. My husband, who's your dean, asked me, don't you think you should talk to her because you survived being a whistleblower and no whistleblowers go to you? I said, no, she doesn't listen to me. She's you. Be the dean you wish I had had. Be the dean who knows that the governor signs the checks that fund your medical school, but you're going to protect her anyway. And that's what he ended up doing, but it's very stressful. And he's stressed out all the time about fighting the governor who writes the checks to support the medical school, who now everybody wants to have fired as a government. But that's one of the things you have to do as a administrator. As I say to him all the time, that's why you're paid the big bucks, because otherwise I don't know why you're paid. Exactly right. Resist branding. Just every time you see your university talking about the brand, turn your back, throw up your hands, tell them you don't work for Nike. There is no brand in academia. The reason there can be no brand is because academic freedom is about the concept that every idea must be thought about and argued. Brands are about single ideas, about single concepts, about marketing slogans. They are the opposite of freedom. They are narrowly construed. And the more your university talks about the brand, the more endangered you become. Because brands don't tolerate diversities of messages. Brands are all about singular messages. They're dangerous. And when I see universities talking about the brand, it absolutely hurts them. And then finally, and this one can be hard, put loyalty to the pursuit of evidence above loyalty to your colleagues. I don't mean you shouldn't protect your colleagues, you should, but when you get in a situation where somebody makes a claim about somebody else, or somebody makes a claim about somebody's research, rather than siding with who you normally would side with based on your political and personal loyalties, step back and ask yourself, what does the evidence tell me about what's really going on in the situation? And a lot of the time, you're going to find that the evidence is actually a lot more complicated and potentially in a different direction than I think. And this is exactly why I keep finding myself as a feminist researcher defending straight white men, because a lot of the time, the persecution of them turns out not to be evidence-based. This is an incredibly important thing. So the bottom line of this book, Galileo's Middle Finger, talks about Galileo and his middle finger being the only thing that's left of him. Really, I'm not going to tell you why it is, because I'm going to try and tell you the long story of it. But basically, it turned out to be the perfect metaphor of this book, because the only thing left of Galileo is Galileo giving the universe a bird. Basically saying, I was right, in spite of all the identity politics dogma pushed against me about the church trying to retain power. At the end of the day, looking up at the heavens, that's what he's doing with the finger, that's why it's closed up, he's looking up at the heavens, saying, ultimately, is the evidence that will save us. Well, Galileo, when he was buried, he was out of favor with the church, so they buried him in a plain grave. And what happened was 100 years later, everybody realized he was right, and he was moved to his grand basilica tomb at the Basilica di Santa Croce in Florence. And it was when his body was being moved 100 years after his death that somebody chopped off a bunch of his fingers because they were a dégoûté. And he used to save people's body parts if you know the grave. Napoleon's penis is saved by somebody. And there's body parts, like discussion body parts all over the world, that people consider to be heroes. And what happened was, at that point, that he was understood to be right and understood to be so important. But more importantly, what had happened by that point was the enlightenment full blown. And part of what happened with it to objective knowledge. The same thing was true with the democratic systems being set up at the same time in the Enlightenment. So one of the things people don't know, a lot of the founding fathers in the United States were science geeks. They had telescopes, they studied plants, they were science geeks. And the reason was they believed, for the first time in history, that the human was capable of knowing the world in a way that didn't require a godly influence. It didn't require a dogma. It didn't require a Bible. It didn't require a holy text. You yourself could engage with the world. And that's what they were trying to do, was to bring together the vote, bring together jury trials, bring together all this, the same concept that they brought to science, the idea basically of crowdsourcing. That the more we come together as average citizens, the better we can do at coming together. And so ultimately what happened in the Enlightenment was that democracy and science were joined at the beginning, and they are still joined. The pursuit of justice in America and the pursuit of truth in America are absolutely dependent on each other. And if one gets harmed, the other one gets harmed. So if you care personally about social justice movements, you have to also care about the people who pursue truth. Because you cannot have sustainable social justice policies without knowing reality. And if you care about wanting to pursue truth, then you have to absolutely care about justice, because you cannot do the search for truth unless you have a just system that allows you to do doing that. So that's the ultimate message of this book, is that you have to care about justice and truth together and pursue both of them for the sake of social democracy. Thank you.
So you highlighted the fire as one of your supporters or allies. I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit about that, about you might say the broad spectrum of support, and kind of non-partisan, non-ideological approach you see as useful for this kind of.
Yeah, so I think the reason that fire gets seen as being conservative or politically on the right is because a lot of the shout-down that occurs on campuses right now occurs from the left. And so if you're going to fight the shouting down that's occurring, you're going to appear to be on the right. But my own experience with fire is that no matter what you come to them in terms of an academic freedom problem, if they see it, and it's pretty obvious when you have an academic freedom problem, they will assist you with it. So for example, Laura Kipnis' situation, right, where the university was basically persecuting her because she had joked about the sexual harassment policy, made the administration foolish. They were willing to take that out as an issue, not because they were attacking Title IX per se, but because they saw her as being used as a sort of way to go after a woman daring to talk about sex. In my situation, where I was dealing with a censorship over an issue of sexuality, progressive sexuality, disability rights, they had no hesitation in terms of assisting me. What's happened on American campuses is that there's been a wonderful empowerment of people who traditionally were marginalized. But sometimes empowerment results in people ending up with a lot of privilege that they end up using actually to shut down systems in ways that are problematic. So for example, one of the things that FIRE fights is free speech zones on campus. In free speech zones are places where universities have decided they're going to set aside a building or a room or a courtyard where they will allow anybody to say anything, but elsewhere you're restricted in what they're allowed to say. And that to me is deeply problematic. That's not to say that people should be allowed to harass you, certainly not. But it's also the case that you should be allowed in the classroom to say something that is politically challenging to everybody else in the room, and to be protected in doing so. And so if you have a situation where students feel like the only place they can say something that's politically unpopular is in a particular courtyard, that is not a situation that can be freedom. So they fight situations where there are these free speech zones. They fight policies that try to shut stuff down. You know, and honestly, what we find over and over again, as I study these cases that occur, is you think that you're supporting the progressive cause by creating all these things where people are not allowed to say those things. But when the administration comes in and deploys those things, it's often deployed deployed against people like me, people on the left, people who are women, people of color. These are people are gay, but it's often deployed against us. And so I think we should be very careful about creating a situation where we tell people that certain things are intolerable to say, intolerable to hear, because ultimately when it comes back and bites us on the ass, it's the people making large 6- and 7-figure salaries who are actually enforcing these things, and they don't tend to be people who are just protecting people like me. That's the reality of the relationship in the question. So it's really, really dangerous. Did that answer your question?
I might actually regret asking this, but kind of topical. Donald Trump has gained quite a bit of support for his lack of concern towards being politically correct, and I was wondering where that may or may not align with your personal stance.
I love Donald Trump as an entertainment device, but it's kind of terrifying, isn't it, that in fact he has as much support as he does for saying the kinds of things that, well, that frankly 10 years ago people would have been ashamed to say in public, but they're no longer ashamed to say. So I find myself tortured, right? On the one hand, I am astonished that there's so much support for so many statements that are bigoted, openly bigoted, right? Sexist, homophobic, anti-immigrant, anti-people of color, I mean, racist, absolutely awful stuff. On the other hand, I think, well, you know what, if these people honestly think this stuff, in some ways I'd rather have them say it so that we actually know what we're facing. And in some ways, it's almost refreshing, because I've had so many students say to me, you know, why do you still consider yourself a feminist and a person who fights for racial equality and issues of LGBT equality? You know, we're post-feminist, we're post-racial. And then Donald Trump does us the favor of showing, no, we're not. We are not at the point where we have equal rights. We are not at the point where people are not openly racist. In fact, you can easily point to that. So in some ways, I think it's useful. I'm terrified of the thought that he might win, right? Absolutely terrified. Because I think that he really would set us back, not only because he has absolutely no qualifications for the job, perhaps that is the most important thing, but at the same time, I think in some ways it's useful that for all the people who keep saying to those of us who fight for progressive rights, there's no more work to be done, we can point to Trump's following and say, there's actually a lot of work to be done. And a lot of that work is going to end up having to be done on campuses where we have vigorous conversations about these things. You know, one of the things that some scholars have been pointing to lately, and I think they're absolutely right, is the fact that there is not political diversity on campuses among the faculty. Faculty tend to lean heavily left in every survey you ever do. I think that's a problem, and I think we need to begin to start thinking about political diversity within faculty, in part because students deserve that. Students deserve to be exposed to a greater range of beliefs. But also, I think research is more vigorous when it has people coming from a lot of different standpoints. And in addition to that, at the most base level, I think if we reach the point where we've got political conservatives whose jobs are under threat just as much as the rest of us, they will begin to start fighting back with us. And that will be useful because they'll have a political coalition of academics that will be a legitimate political coalition fighting against systems that try to oppress us. So I would like to see more political diversity in campuses, and we don't have it. I'm not sure how we achieve that. People on the left tend to be drawn to academia more than people on the right, in part because of the self-selecting process that occurs, right? So people who want to be with other lefties tend to go where the lefties are, and that tends to be the coffee shops and particularly plus the universities. But the other thing that occurs is people who are progressive also tend not to care that much about social status and about income. They care less about that, so they're more willing to take on university jobs because these are highly intelligent people who frankly could be earning a lot more money. And the people who are progressive sometimes are willing to take a lot less money because they're fighting for progressive cause. But I think there are people who are more politically conservative who are ready to be academics in their ranks and who need to have these academics in their ranks because our students would benefit, because our research would benefit, and because ultimately academia would get content. Of course, I can say that because I don't work in the university myself.
So I know a lot of discussion has been going on here. Kenyon recently has been surrounding trigger warnings because on the one hand it's obviously important to protect people that have been survivors of some kind of trauma, especially with what's going on with Title IX recently. But then I think certain people also see it as a way of preventing professors from challenging their students intellectually. So as someone who cares both about medical ethics and sexual rights and freedoms, and someone who cares about censorship. What's your take on trigger warnings as a positive or negative?
In general, I think the whole trigger warning thing has gotten completely out of control. I mean, it's become a source of mockery because it's gotten so out of control. It is true that for some people with post-traumatic stress disorder, there are certain things that will trigger them. But historically speaking, those tend to be things that the person knows will trigger them, and that person is taught to tell people around them what it is that might cause that trigger. So, for example, a classic one is loud sounds for people who have been through wars. Very often a loud sound will trigger for a veteran a post-traumatic stress disorder response. So we know, for example, that some people who have been through sexual assault will be triggered by the fact that they'll hear about a sexual assault being discussed. I think we have to distinguish the needs of that individual from the needs of the whole and recognize there probably are ways to deal with the needs of the individual that don't need to so intensely interfere with our ability to have conversations. And that is to recognize the need for a trigger warning as a legitimate disability that can be dealt with through the usual disability channels, and to say there are ways that we can manage this by giving assistance to make sure that we go ahead and recognize that we, for example, notify professors that if there's a person who's a particular issue, the professor is notified. If they're incapable of being in the class because there might be intense triggers, provide an alternative situation where they can get the same basic education in a different class situation. These kinds of things. I think what's ended up happening is a situation where people are using trigger warning sometimes to simply say that upsets me, and that's not the same as what trigger warning originally meant, which was a legitimate triggering of a post-traumatic stress disorder response. So there are ways to deal with this, and to my mind, having a triggered response is basically a signifying of a disability, a legitimate disability, and that we should deal with it through the disability systems and recognize that that's a way to deal with it, and not to have it be simply stuff makes me uncomfortable. The fact is we should make our students uncomfortable. Every time I've taught, I've always made my students uncomfortable. I mean, the students at Northwestern who are medical students could tell you that they learned the point of the class every time we went for 10 weeks together. The bottom line for me was the lesson they should take home was the Nazis didn't think they were Nazis. Now, somebody who has a Jewish history could certainly feel that that was a sort of outrageous statement, but you have to take a class with me for 10 weeks to realize why I'm telling you that. I mean, the answer to the bottom line why I tell them that and teach them that is because I want them to recognize there is bad stuff they're going to do that they're not going to be able to see what they are doing, and they need to be able to have systems in place to make sure they don't do bad things, thinking, well, I'm too smart and too righteous and too perfect to do anything wrong in the world. But that kind of situation, right, requires me to challenge them over and over again. One of the things I do is I challenge their concepts of racism, I challenge their concepts of sexism, I challenge their concepts of medicine. You know, for years at Michigan State, we hosted Anita Hill, which a lot of people don't know too young, but it's the thing that set off a final awareness of how sexual harassment plays out in the workplace. It's a very important situation because Anita Hill versus Clarence Thomas talking about sexual harassment. What it set off with in universities was sexual harassment policies. The original ones were absolutely absurd. So the original one at Michigan State, when I was trying to teach this class on sex and gender, actually said that I was not allowed to show photographs of genitals. Well, I was teaching about intersex, and I was needing to show my students what we were talking about with regard to the genital development of intersex, so that they could understand the surgeries that were occurring, we could look at pictures, we could talk about human parts. But according to the sexual harassment policy at Michigan State at the time, that constituted sexual harassment by students. I was also not allowed to ask them to think about their own sexual orientations at all. I wasn't asking them to report back to me what theirs were, but I did do exercises in which I had them think about their own biases in terms of their sexual orientation, but that was a violation of policy. You end up in a situation potentially where you legislate so much of this stuff, you never make the student uncomfortable enough to help them grow. You know, one of my professors in graduate school said the most useful thing to me when I was being stubborn on something. He said to me, if you haven't changed your mind lately, how do you know it's working? And I ended up thinking really hard about that and realizing that, you know what, every time I change my mind because I've thought about something different, I should think of that as a good thing, not as a bad thing, right? So I try always to encourage my students to think, I'm going to make you really uncomfortable because there's places in your cognitive system that are broken that you need to examine. I'm not going to tell you where they're broken. You're going to do the work here with me. But we're going to look at our minds and think about our minds in the ways that we're working. Today, that kind of teaching is considered much too threatening in the environments. And I think That's not to say anybody should be subject to sexual harassment, racial harassment, and any of the rest of it. But the ways that I think we can deal with that are structural ways that enable us to talk about it rather than simply legislate constantly against any kind of potential events, potential discomfort, potential argument. It's just really problematic. I think if I did some of the stuff I did 20 years ago today, it would just be, one of the things I taught my students about was birth. And birth in the lithotomy position, which is when you have your legs up, right? The way most women in America give birth, which is a really bad way to give birth, is when you got your legs up. It's not a good way to get a baby out, physiologically speaking, versus birth in a squatting position. And so when I used to teach my students on the history of birth, because I was teaching them history of medicine, I would get up on the table in the front and I would demonstrate birth in the lithotomy position. I'd show them the baby probably is birth in the squatting position. And then today, some student could make a charge against me that that was somehow overly sexualizing my own body and therefore was a problem. But my students found it very useful because they could visualize. I had a teddy bear, and they could visualize why the teddy bear comes out, how it's all that way, the teddy bear comes out this way. And the stuff I did was, I don't think morally problematic, but today I would be terrified of doing that stuff. That's the situation.
You talked a lot about the importance of defending really controversial ideas and people who deny the existence
The right to.
the right to it. It would be who deny the Holocaust. And I was just wondering if you think that even hate speech should be protected for that reason.
Speech protected, absolutely, but we should also prove that he's wrong. So we should do all the work necessary to constantly remind people why, in fact, the Holocaust did happen. I actually think that's useful. So a few years ago, I was at a sex research conference. Believe me, they're always weird, right? There are always people who study sex, so it's always really weird. We like watch pornography and discuss it. Sex research conferences are weird. But one of the papers that somebody gave, they did a study showing that alcohol reduces your sexual inhibition. And I thought, I need to invent something called the Duh Award. Right? And the Duh Award would be given to the paper, the study with the most work put into the most obvious conclusion. Right? Sexual inhibition is only alcohol, we need to do this. But then I realized the Duh Award would be really great, because one of the things we could do would be to take assumptions that we have and either prove them or disprove them. And that's one of the things that I think we could do with the Holocaust denial, is to renew our knowledge about the Holocaust and to say, that can't possibly be true, could it? And here are all the reasons we know that that's not true. And to renew and reinvigorate the conversations about those important things would be incredibly important. So even though I thought that guy was crazy, by the way, he was an electrical engineer, Holocaust denial, right? If he has any authority in history or Jewish studies whatsoever, but he was a Holocaust denial electrical engineer. And with the right wing, the heavy-duty neo-Nazi press would vote, they would just say his professor, his name was Butts. Professor Butts at Northwestern University. They wouldn't mention the electrical engineering, right? They would just mention that he agrees the Holocaust never really happened. If we could renew our invigorated attitude towards that and say, here's the data that we have, here's the reason we need to keep talking about Holocaust, because Holocaust deniers exist, that's useful. The kinds of places where that stupidity occurs is even useful to us. And I'd like to see that kind of data occur, because I think it's incredibly useful. The most recent winner of the Dell Award, we did a study showing that your libido goes down if you have enough sleep. Really? We spend money? Anybody's ever had a child?
I'm probably one of those people who want to slap upside your head.
I'm going to do it.
Please, I really liked what you said. I really appreciate it. I really tell you that it's really not a matter of conservatives not wanting to be in academia or wanting big six-figure salaries. That's not the story at all. And you also have to know, if you don't already, that there are plenty of a few conservatives around in this room. So you're hoping to have conservative allies. Boy, we're hoping to have liberal allies. So there's that. But the other thing is this. This is such an old story. I had this feeling of deja vu all over again. When I was a kid, one of my friends in middle school, junior high school, was a guy in Cornell, his father, Cornell, had protected against McCarthy. And it was just obvious. The good guys were the free speech liberals. The bad guys were the right-wingers who wanted to shut people up. I used to work for Sidney Hook, his first Marxist philosopher, and he wrote the guidelines for the AAUP back in the 1930s. And this is really old stuff. And I also know something happened, and when you say social progress depends on this, I agree with you. But Robert Paul Wolff, who was Herbert Marcuse's popularizer in America, wrote a piece once where he said, look, you guys on the new left who want to take over the university and shut up everybody, it's not time to do it yet. We haven't got enough control. Let's pretend we're in favor of academic freedom, and then we can make our move. What happened was, in the 60s, that the left decided that the university was part of the social struggle, that it was turf, and that meant that you had to contest it for the sake of a political end which transcended academic freedom. And that suggests there's at least a certain tension between the search for social justice, meaning getting results, and the kind of old-fashioned liberalism that you espouse that I like so much. But from looking at it from what ended up being the right for me, I didn't mean to start there. A large part of the reason I ended up there was because I saw the liberals had sold out and become social justice warriors. And I know that doesn't exactly fit what you were saying, but maybe you'd like to respond.
Yeah, you know, the AAUP did in fact do a lot of really terrific work on academic freedom, and certainly the era of McCarthy was, in some ways, much more terrifying because they really could full-blown ruin their life and ruin their family's life. And since families often would depend on a single income, it ruined entire families. I wish the AAUP were as vigorous as it used to be. Part of the problem with them today is that university administrations just don't take it very seriously, and that's a shame. And it's partly because university professors choose not to be part of the AAUP. It's the American Association of University Professors, which is meant to be sort of a political union of university professors. And part of the problem there is, you know, the anti-union sentiments that occurred that also had to do with class issues and professors seeing themselves as middle upper class, not working class, and unions of the working class at AAUP, there's difficulties in that way. So it's a shame to me that we don't have a political organization that's vigorous and national in terms of unionization of professors, because I think we really need that again. You know, is it the case that the excesses of the left have gone too far? Absolutely, and actually my book is a lot about the excesses of the left. That said, I don't actually think that being on the left is the same as being the derogatory term social justice warrior. That what I see social justice warriors engaged in is ad hominem attacks with absolutely no evidence base. And where I think we can all join and agree on is the idea that we should argue over facts and try to argue over the search for facts and how we're going to do that and argue over epistemology and not necessarily argue over the political outcome that we want. And that's where I think we can end up going. You know, there are some professors who are political conservatives, but a lot of them tell me they're afraid to be out about it. And I actually don't blame them. I think it can be very, very risky to be politically out as a religious person in most universities and also as a political conservative. And that I think we have to examine our consciences about and ask ourselves, what is it about it that we don't allow for that type of diversity? We want to celebrate every other type of diversity, but we somehow can't tolerate political diversity and genuine religious diversity in the sense that people who may be quite religiously conservative are not tolerated in university campuses. So it's nice to meet somebody more cynical than me. I don't feel like it's exactly the same as what we were occurring with the McCarthy era, because I actually think it's worse in certain ways today. But what I would say is that even if it has happened before, it has happened in a way that is extremely tsunami-like today. Like almost every day I open the paper and read about another tenured professor fired. The levels at which this is occurring, the lack of social outrage, it's being reported there's no social outrage, is really, really scary. And we're going to have to watch places like UNC and the Wisconsin system to see where it goes next. But the people in Wisconsin are legitimately terrified of what's going to happen in terms of the government and university system. And I think it's going to deeply harm the state of Wisconsin. It already is deeply harming the state of Wisconsin. Because the first people who leave the universities are people who can. And those two will be people with the biggest grants, the most productive research, the best teaching, et cetera, et cetera. People who can and will leave, and that is the university system. I think we should wrap up because I'm getting signals. So thank you all so much for coming.